John Venasek to introduce Nicole Allen.
All right. So I am John Venasek. I am the Humanities and Open Education Librarian here at UCF, and I'd like to introduce Nicole Allen, who is the Director of Open Education at Spark, and she's going to talk to us today about open education in a changing landscape. With that, I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thanks so much, John. And a changing landscape it is. Hi, everyone. I apologize that I am feeling a little bit under the weather. So please bear with me as I sniffle through this talk. But I'm very happy to be here because this community matters. And I think this is a really important time to take a step back and look at the landscape that we're operating within as an open education movement. The last year in particular, the last few years, the last decade has just been a time of incredibly rapid change. And so much has happened. And I think thinking about the moment that we're in right now and how we can orient open education to that is really important. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. I decided to make things even harder on myself by not doing slides for this talk. I really want this to be a conversation and just sort of talk to you about my thoughts and how I'm thinking about and approaching the space. And I'll be that gives me the opportunity to watch the chat during the talk, so I will be doing so. Feel free to jump in with questions, comments, anything you're thinking. So the through line I want you to think about as I'm talking is that open education has always been about the relationship to knowledge. It's not just about resources or stuff or access. It's about being active and participatory and making materials revisable, being transparent and accountable. And I think that's what's at stake as we think about open education in the current landscape. And I want to start somewhere a little bit more personal in how I'm making sense of the moment that we're in. And this may resonate with any other 80s babies out there in the audience. But I came of age at the time of the rise of the internet. I started high school in 1999 and went to college in the mid 2000s. And like now, that was a time of rapid change where the rules were being rewritten in real time and nobody fully knew what would come next. And on one hand, the rise of the internet, it was just like this incredible sense of wonder. I sometimes think back to those few glorious years at the height of like Napster, where we all saw what it was like if we just ignored copyright and shared everything freely with each other on the web, music, movies, articles. Putting together this playlist of open walk-on songs would have been really easy at that time. Obviously completely illegal, but illustrated just what is possible with the technology that we have. And when you connect all of humanity together or much of humanity together and remove the barriers that we've chosen to create for ourselves. I think Wikipedia is also a great example of that emerged around this time. It was chaotic and contested and dismissed by institutions, but on the other hand, it was the largest collaborative knowledge project in human history and has preserved and extended so much of humanity's knowledge in a really radical and open way. And I think that was the early promise of a genuinely open and participatory relationship with knowledge at scale and in a way that humanity had never had the opportunity to do before. And I just remember sitting in college in 2004, having this cognitive dissonance of going to the bookstore and buying an expensive textbook that was out of date in print and at the same time watching this incredible wealth of knowledge unfold on the internet where it was abundant. And that's part of what drove me into my career as an open advocate straight out of college. As a student, I advocated for open education and have spent my entire career working with various nonprofits advocating for openness and affordability in higher ed. But that sense of wonder was sort of only part of it. That era was also shaped by 9/11 and the massive political changes that happened in the wake of that. The Patriot Act, in the surveillance state, a government making confident claims about truth that turned out to be false, and just a dramatic political shift happening at the same time of this radical technological change. Um, and then came the financial crisis. My generation, or many in my generation, finished college, ready to step into the world. We were told, go to college, take on debt, get a degree, and you'll be fine. There'll be a job on the other side. But with the 2008 financial crisis, the economy collapsed, and that just wasn't the world that we entered into. And it's interesting because today's learners are navigating an environment that sort of rhymes with all of this. It's a technological revolution that has that sense of wonder that some of us experience when we interact with AI, but also the incredible threat of that technology, and a political climate that's reshaping institutions, and a job market that's being disrupted by AI, and nobody can fully predict what things are going to look like even in a year. And that parallel is worth sitting with for a moment. And what I find really interesting about these moments of rapid transformation is that they do create the potential for change, sort of this liminal space. Like, norms aren't set yet. We don't know what the future looks like. The choices aren't fixed. And there's genuine possibility for shaping what comes next. The decisions being made today are going to define the future. And the ways that we can show up with intention and action can have an influence, and what gets built shapes everything that happens downstream. And I think it's notable that open education was born during this, one of these plastic moments in the early 2000s. Like, Creative Commons was founded in 2001. I think OpenStax was 99. MIT OpenCourseware around the same time. The Cape Town Open Education Declaration was 2007, 2008, that really galvanized and articulated a global movement for open education. And this was one of those attempts to help shape the norms of how we do education in this new interconnected environment, and insist that knowledge should be open and shared in all of the ways that are possible, and not locked down in ways that are artificial and proprietary. And that was inspiring, and open education exists today because people showed up during that moment and pushed for that change. So I want to talk a little bit about the forces that are shaping the moment that we're in now, before coming back to how we can sort of think about how to orient ourselves to that moment of change, and what we can push for. So the first force I want to talk about, there are three forces I'm going to talk about. The first is political. And I think we've all been living through that. And rather than sort of gesture at it vaguely, I am going to take a couple minutes and just inventory what has happened over the last year, because it's unfolded so fast. It's easy to lose track of the full picture. So, thinking back to a little bit over a year ago, at the change of the U.S. presidential administration, things started to change immediately. First came a set of executive orders that were targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion across federal agencies and institutions that receive federal funding. Research grants that were terminated, including work that related to gender and race, public health, climate. Broad funding freezes created immediate chaos at universities that are dependent on federal research and grant dollars, and ripple effects of those freezes extended well beyond higher ed, with profound impacts on communities and organization, both here in the US and also abroad. There were steps to eliminate entire federal agencies, IMLS, the Department of Education, to varying degrees of success, but certainly those actions and executive orders had a significant impact. And the pressure only escalated. Indirect cost caps for NIH and NSF funded research threatened university research infrastructure. Um, Restrictions on international students and faculty, including entry bans from some countries, reshaped who could be on campus, and immigration enforcement created questions about who felt safe on campus. And threats about accreditation put institutional governance and viability on the table, and all sorts of impacts extended far beyond the federal level and far before these changes began happening at the federal level, at the state level, with legislation that impacts academic freedom and reshapes, what can be taught and how in higher education in a way that has not been customary in the US. And of course, the response to that has been varied. I think the most visible responses are compliance. Columbia, UVA, Brown, Penn striking deals with the administration that included various actions from ending DEI programs, providing admissions data related to race, revising definitions about gender, allowing a federal presence on campus, things like that. Of course, responses have been varied, but those are often the ones that we think about. And of course, this has impacted our work as the institutions working to educate the coming generations, but also as individual practitioners that need to make calculations about, what is allowed to say, what are they allowed to say? Programs that quietly sort of contract or go away, and the feeling of, in some cases, of needing to self-censor, and that all being a rational response to an unpredictable environment. And of course, this has impacted open education specifically. Some programs having to, just lose their funding or change focus or change the language that they use, and that really matters in work that is, regardless of its whether it actually conflicts with policy, may, because of its focus on expanding access to all and serving all students, and being able to tailor materials to individuals who need that support the most, can look like that, even though, regardless of whether it's compliant with policies or not, or deemed compliant with policies or not. And people in the open education space have had to make real calculations about what they can say, what's safe to publish, what's safe to teach, and that has impacted our work. And some of this pressure, I think, has perhaps eased in some places as policies have made their way through the courts, and there's perhaps a less of an acute sense of chaos. But the landscape has shifted, and the effects of that are real. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind as we think about what we can do and what comes next. The second force that I want to talk about is talking about the infrastructure at our institutions. So I talked a little bit about the political forces. There are also commercial forces that are shaping higher ed institutions right now. It's landing at a time where higher education systems are already under enormous pressure. There's a crisis of confidence in the value of a degree. There's a student debt crisis. There's years of disinvestment in public institutions, declining enrollments and changes in demographics, and many of the features that higher education was built to serve are changing. And as we are facing these changes, there are parts of what is being perhaps destroyed or changed or gone away that we can leave behind, in addition to the real harms. And I do think that some of the movement of higher ed toward commercial capture and moving much of its infrastructure into the hands of an increasingly small number of companies that control the systems inside higher ed, how data is used. And these tools just span the entire institution from teaching, research, administration, libraries. They, in many cases, are reshaping the decision making and control of how decisions are made. That's from research, from library infrastructure to admissions. And this is even before we get to the conversation about AI. Data that would be unthinkable to collect in physical contexts is now collected routinely on people, collected by publisher platforms. And third parties get to learn all sorts of things about our students and our faculty and be able to use that data in commercial ways. They're predictive analytics that influence enrollment and retention decisions and tools that shape academic integrity processes. And these systems are often controlled by the same set of companies. And there is a real risk of those commercial interests influencing the decisions that are made within institutions. And I think this is playing out really visibly within course materials. The conversation in open education has sort of long been about price and how we can replace expensive commercial textbooks with open resources that are much less expensive or free. But the terrain has actually really shifted in that fight. And the crisis with course materials right now is maybe less about affordability and more about control and the platforms that these resources on. Of course, the affordability fight still matters. But today's course materials are no longer passive resources. They're platforms. They're homework systems that students need to pay in order to use and turn in assignments. It's courseware that embeds, perhaps vendor commercial priorities into the structure of teaching and learning, and access models where the content can be shut off at the end of the term and students can't access their resources long term. And we've seen that many of the large textbook companies really are redirecting their main business areas into being technology companies and building businesses around the data that they can collect. And in some cases, major executives of these companies just talking openly with investors about their plans for the data that they're able to collect through higher education materials to feed into lifelong profiles on students that can be used for things like their products in the workforce space or employment space. And it's really creating an environment where the platforms that higher ed is investing in and using and working with to deliver education are treating students as customers. And a user base to be monetized, as opposed to the learners that institution exists to support and set up to be members of our economy and our society. And I think that's a fundamental shift in how higher ed needs to be looking at our infrastructure. It's not just about price, it's about who controls the content or the platforms, and is that aligned with the mission of the university? And the long-term risks of ceding control of this space to an increasingly small number of companies that can, as they gain more control, lock higher ed into these systems that have, potentially detrimental impacts on our students and look at our students as customers and data to be monetized instead of humans. So, I think this matters for open education directly because the transition to a lot of these platforms is creating a chilling effect on the use of open educational resources and even open educational practices, and helping to separate teachers from learners and automate more of this process. And I think it's a real space where open education can come back and assert its relevance. But speaking of humanity, I want to move on to the third area of the third force that's reshaping the landscape. And of course, that's artificial intelligence. And my feelings about AI are really complex because it does have that same feeling of wonder that I described earlier with Napster, where just we're able to do things that are just incredible. And it has, to me at least, the same feeling that the open internet had back in the day of just the incredible potential and the wonder and the things that are possible that were never possible. And I think there are real and pragmatic reasons why the positive aspects of AI really matter for open education. Like creating an OER textbook is dramatically more possible now than it was 5 years ago, or easier now than it was 5 years ago. It's possible to do things like generate drafts of content and potentially illustrations rapidly to get help with like proofreading and streamlining content and formatting and produce the kind of polished materials that were previously the hallmark of traditional publishers and often perceived as markers of quality just because of their resource intensiveness. And similarly, students have access to personalized opportunities, for tutoring and personalized educational resources and tools that can be used for a variety of diverse learning styles. And before I say any more, I want to make sure to make a huge caveat that there are so many issues with the use of AI on its own. It alone cannot replace the humanity in this work. And there's so many issues that we need to navigate about how AI is created, the environmental impacts of how it's run. And all of that needs to be acknowledged and cannot be ignored. But I also think that it's important to think about the positive impacts of it as well, because like it or not, it's here. But AI is reshaping, on a deeper level, how we relate to knowledge itself. These AI systems ingest massive amounts of human knowledge and reflect it back is seamless and authoritative output. And there are no sources, no invitation to question or interrogate, or nobody to talk to about why they chose one perspective over another. And the experience of receiving something from AI, knowledge becomes something that's an output rather than something that you engage with and wrestle with. And I think Wikipedia is an interesting illustration of that, because how Wikipedia was built was so much about the chat page in each article, where the different contributors are talking about the perspectives that they're bringing, their conflicts of interest, and why one source is used over another, or why one fact is presented over another. And I think that debate is so much part of how human knowledge comes about, and just all of that is lost in how AI presents knowledge. And in fact, AI has had such an impact on Wikipedia itself in terms of drawing traffic away and ingesting all of that hard-won content that humans thought over and developed, and being able to just spit it out without any of that history or attribution. So it really changes how we're engaging with knowledge. And that, of course, is true with how it's happening in the classroom, the types of assignments and assessments that have, long been the backbone of education, essays, problem sets, conducting research. It all can seemingly now be completed by AI. And I think from the student perspective, I know if this type of technology existed back when I was college, I would view that as magic too. But it raises hard questions about how do we inspire learning at a time when machines can seemingly do it so much better than us. And what does it mean to learn something when the answer is always available, and available in a much more seamless and ready to eat way than it even was at the time of when search engines were rising and Google was rising, where you at least had to search through sources. And then, of course, what skills do students actually need for the workforce that is being reshaped by the existence of these tools and the jobs that are going away and the new skills that are needed? And these are not easy questions, and they're questions that I think really lend themselves to the strength of open education and thinking about knowledge, not just something that we serve up or access, but something that is participatory, that we wrestle with, where the struggle of learning actually matters. And that uniquely human struggle that is inherent to the learning process. So I think the deep question that we're at in this moment is like, what kind of relationship to knowledge do we want to cultivate? Is it that active, participatory type of relationship, or is it one that is ready-made and over time will increasingly be abstracted from humanity? And I think open education is so firmly, and the values of open education are so firmly on that side of making knowledge open to everybody and building it with everybody. So it makes open education so much more important and relevant in this moment than it has ever been. So I've covered the what I have to say about the three forces: the political forces reshaping institutions, the platforms that are reshaping our infrastructure, and how AI is changing how we relate to knowledge. And I now want to talk a little bit about what the open advocate can actually do. So advocating for open education is something that everybody can do, and it's more important now than ever. And I think it's important in this moment where there are some contexts where it may feel like you can't talk about open in the way that you've always wanted to, or you need to downplay certain aspects of it. Coming from an advocacy background, there's a long tradition of advocates making arguments for a cause that's tailored to their particular audience, focusing on the points that matter and leaving the ones that don't. That's not a compromise. It's just how change actually happens. And I think back to some of my earlier days in policy advocacy, where I'd be on Capitol Hill and I'd walk into a Democratic office and make the case for open education as a pathway for social justice and equity and access for all, and helping students who are underserved and marginalized, and helping them first. And then walk into a Republican office and talk about open education as a pathway to freeing knowledge and expanding access to transparent information that parents and learners can both access and understand what's in the material, and make that public so everybody can see it and critique it. Reducing dependence on monopolies and expensive materials, and giving institutions the freedom to own their infrastructure and customize materials to suit their own needs. There are different frames that we can make the argument for openness, and every one of those arguments is 100% true. And it just depends what's going to convince the audience that you're talking to. So as advocates, we just need to know our room. And it's not a compromise to make the case for open education in a variety of different ways, whether that's affordability, whether that's sustainability and ownership over content, or if it's about serving the underserved students. And I think it's important to note, like, one of the biggest victories that we've had in open education policy, the open securing funding for the federal open textbook pilot program, that has crossed administrations. The first time that we secured that funding, it was under the first Trump administration in 2018 in a bipartisan public budget deal. And though our champion is, of course, Democratic Senator Dick Durbin, it was It did have bipartisan support, and we have continued to secure funding for that program throughout all configurations of Congress, including the most recent um, victory of getting $7 million for that program secured in the current fiscal year. We're still waiting for details on what exactly that's going to look like from the Department of Education, but that is evidence that we can make the case for open across political contexts. So, of course, openness is complex in this moment. And the thing about openness is that it enables so many positive uses, but you can't always control how your resources are used. And some of you may have seen there was a recent example where an open textbook was taken by in Florida. And some of the words that were used to describe it is that it was, quote, sanitized of social justice-oriented content, and to make it what they perceived as compliant with existing law. And it was heavily edited and used at certain institutions. And there's criticism that the fact that that open resource was out there enabled them to do that. And that's an open use of a resource that isn't necessarily aligned with open values. But I think it's important to remember that open answers this moment in a really profound way, which is that you can do anything you want with a derivative, but the original resource is still available for everyone, everywhere to access. And that's not true of commercial resources. The commercial textbook industry has a long and well-documented history of changing the content of their resources to meet political requirements within states, primarily within K-12. But, the absence of an open textbook is not going to stop people from creating adaptations of a resource that, one might not agree with. But what having an open resource is going to do is make sure that everybody has access to the original resource. So I think open in this moment provides, in some ways, an escape hatch and ensures continued access to knowledge and dissemination of knowledge at a time where, in some contexts, certain types of knowledge is being locked down. And I think that's true for platform lockdown as well. Open can be that escape hatch as we increasingly march toward having our course materials and other infrastructure at institutions locked down within an increasingly small number of companies. We can think about openness as our way out of that, having access to educational materials that we can own and control and put on our own servers and know who is collecting the data and where that data goes and how it's being secured. And think about the curriculum that we're using at our institutions and the course materials that go with that, not just as commodities or objects that can be outsourced to a company like Barnes & Noble or Follett to manage through an automatic textbook billing program. But as fundamental infrastructure of the institution that is worthy of viewing as a collection that needs to be curated and managed and made accessible as part of the institution's mission rather than outsourced and left vulnerable to the increasing costs that may be demanded by investors and commercial boardrooms that answer to Wall Street. Again, we're at this moment of change. And as we think about what kinds of change are coming, the norms around AI, the decisions that are being made about infrastructure, none of these decisions are set yet. They're becoming set. And just as the open education movement helped shape some of the norms around the early internet, I think thinking about ways that we can interject into the changes that are happening now. And I know that feels constrained for some students, for some people. The range of action available feels, perhaps smaller than it was in some places, or it feels like the change that is needed is too big to even start on. So my advice is focus on what you can control, because small change adds up. The choices that you make today, whether that's in your classroom, in your institution, in your advocacy, you're laying the groundwork for what becomes possible in the future. And, I talked a little bit about things being destroyed or broken down, and that's certainly true of some of the practices within our institutions. And a moment to rebuild in place of that will come. I don't know when. It could be 2029, it could be later. But when it does, it's the people who've maintained their principles and like kept building, staying ready, staying connected to each other in this work that are going to be the ones that are positioned to shape what can come out of that. And that's sort of everything. Whether those choices are being made in the classroom, in terms of pedagogy and the relationship to knowledge that you model for your students, whether, at your institution, you're writing and sharing OER, advocating for open policies, pushing back against the use of platforms, and getting involved in procurement decisions, especially around things like automatic textbook building. And then I think there's a field-wide aspect of this in terms of advocacy and connecting with others that do the work and making arguments in the kinds of rooms where decisions are made. And on the field front, one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is the emergence of the Open Education Association and the transition of open education from, a movement of passionate advocates that, perhaps sometimes it feels like we're working at the margins. It's becoming a recognized professional discipline with its own research, its own pedagogy, its own infrastructure. And I think it's really exciting to see a association emerging around that. It's still very new, but it is an opportunity to help connect and uplift and shape all of the incredible work that's been developed across the field over time. And part of that association is running the Open Education Conference. And I've been thinking a lot. Some of you may have seen the Open Education Call for Proposals recently came out, and the theme is the space between. And I really love that because that's exactly where we are. It's in that space between what is and what will become, and the things that haven't formed yet. And I think open education has always lived in that space between. It is relational. It's about how we connect with knowledge and think about knowledge as something that's participatory and not just the old ways of producing and distributing it and commoditizing it. And community is just so central to that. And I think thinking about how open education got to where it is about those individual actions and individual people who have been involved. And knowledge is more powerful when it's shared. And that's always going to be true. And the people in this community are the ones that have been doing that work and will keep doing it and will help move us forward into whatever comes next. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back to John, and happy to discuss any points or answer any questions.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. Yes, we have about 7 minutes left, so time for a few questions. And right off the bat, I see one from Kevin Corcoran. Kevin, do you want to read your question?
Sure. I was just posing the question of if one of the biggest challenges for the open community is that we are dependent on either investors like Hewlett or we're dependent on other companies. If we had an organization like a Unison, but specific to open, where there was institutional investment into a shared infrastructure, is that feasible? And what could that solve some of the shared public infrastructure concerns? But does that introduce other problems?
That's a big question, but I will say that now is the time for higher ed institutions to really think about where infrastructure is heading and really play that out. Because I do think there is a need to think about aligning infrastructure with the values of the academic community because right now the values that drive so much of this technology that's becoming so central to the decisions that we make and how learning is conducted is concentrated in the hands of companies that, this isn't pejorative to say, are focused on making money. That's what they exist to do. And that's why higher ed institutions are not, or at least public higher education institutions and private nonprofit institutions are not organized for profit. So I think that level of thinking about how do we come together and, not necessarily build, but find ways to govern infrastructure that can be aligned with the academic community's values. I don't have a solution for when or how or where that starts, but that's exactly the type of systems level thinking we need to be able to do.
All right, next up is Kim Gruey. I hope I got your last name right. Kim, do you want to read your question?
Sure, but I think Nicole already answered it. I put the hearts in there as she was speaking to it, and that
Okay.
was what advice can you provide for someone who works at an institution where perhaps your open values aren't exactly aligned with the institutional values? For example, if you're at an inclusive access institution where they've put all their eggs in that basket. And I kind of think Nicole answered it already, but if she would like to speak to it again, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it comes back to that, making the arguments that are going to convince the audience that you're talking to, and you have a whole basket of options to choose from with open because there's so many reasons why it's good. I think with inclusive access, I hate to say it this way, but the truth will become apparent in time, that these programs, particularly the flat fee or equitable access style programs, just the cost of those is so much farther than what even the bookstore industry says the average student spends on textbooks, that it will become apparent over time the incredible cost of those programs, and there will be an opportunity to make change. So if you can't convince people in the short term that it's not the right way to go, think about what is on the other end of that. So if there is an opportunity to back out of that program, what does that look like? Does that look like the library stepping up and being, taking the lead on textbook procurement and thinking about course materials as a collection as opposed to something that we're outsourcing? How do we get ready for that moment where change is possible?
All right, and I think we have time for one more. Next up on my list is Danny Feinberg.
Hi, Nicole. We've actually met before at a conference in Florida for the OER Summit. My question is, and you did speak to it a little bit, but what do you do when professors are so stuck on holding library materials and treating them as open access materials when in fact they're not typically considered open access? So, like, how do you maneuver professors into using true open access materials? Does that make sense?
Mhm. I guess I could provide a lot of answers to that question. I think an important way to think about it from an advocacy perspective is that there's so many professors, and not all of them want to make a change in how they're teaching or want to change the materials they're using, and that's okay. There's so many professors that may want to or may be willing to when provided with the right support. And as an advocate, it's often important to understand who are your hard no's and who are your possible yeses, and invest your energy in the people who are willing to make a change. So in terms of the arguments that you can make to convince them, I think it really depends on the professor, and faculty are facing so many pressures right now that focusing on the ways that this makes their job easier, not needing to get permission or not needing to worry about copyright when they're copying and sharing things with their students can be benefits of using open resources.
Thank you so much.
All right, and that brings us to time. So, Nicole, thank you very much for your presentation. The next session will be a drop-in discussion on scaling open education at 1 o'clock.